They taught me how to mend canvas when I was 8. How to stitch a tear so the line looked like it had always been part of the cloth. I never imagined I would one day have to stitch my life back together the same way. Patient, precise, with thread chosen to hold up under salt and strain. My name is Ava Mercer. I'm 33. For as long as I remember, Mercer Marine was the anchor of our town. The place with the peeling turquoise sign, the smell of diesel and hot metal, the small crew who could coax a stubborn engine back to life. My father, Thomas Mercer, had built it out of elbow grease and stubborn affection for the sea. He nursed broken hulls as if they were family, and the town loved him for it. I grew up climbing over crates, watching men weld in orange sparks, and learning the particular grammar of boat maintenance that makes sense only to people who sleep to the sound of tide. When he died, quietly at home, in a January that felt like powder and glass, the business and everything that came with it were supposed to be a map of legacies. But a map can be redrawn in the quiet by the people who own the pen. The will reading was wooden and formal, the kind of ceremony that flattens grief into paperwork. I sat with my hands clasped like someone trying not to break a brittle shell. My brother, Lucas, stood near the window with his usual half-smile, a man who had always been good at making it seem like life owed him favors. When the lawyer read the first line assigning the company's shares, the room tightened like a fist. Mercer Marine, the docks, the contracts, the workshops, all went to Lucas. Mother got the house on Harbor Road. A life interest, the lawyer said, which meant she could live there for the rest of her days but held no controlling stake. Me. I was handed a single envelope and a sentence that hit like cold water. You're strong. Find your own way. There are many ways to break a family. Lawsuits, secrets, inheritance. That night at the kitchen table, the paper felt like a bruise. It wasn't only the loss of ownership. It was the erasure. My father had taught me the things that make ships seaworthy and life steady. His hands had been the ones to steady me when the tide of adolescence pushed too hard. For him to tell the world on paper that my future belonged to some other plan, that cut in a particular way. Grief is sharp enough to make you act before you think. For 2 days I wanted to storm the office and scream that I'd worked on those hulls, that I knew the accounts and the vendors and the men who kept the lights on. I wanted to stand at the dock and announce to anyone who would listen that the man who had taught me to read a hull scar had not actually erased me willingly. I wanted to make Lucas feel small and exposed. Righteousness is a tempting lodestar. Then I found the first receipt. It was tucked behind a manila envelope in Dad's file cabinet, where he kept old vendor lists and coffee-stained to-do notes. The receipt was for a shipment of marine-grade steel, ordinary enough, but the invoice number matched another ledger entry that had been redirected to a shell company with a ridiculous name, Atlantic Advisory. A small thing almost invisible except when you started to look and found pattern. Payments had been funneled over the years through assumed consultancies, slightly under the radar but enough in aggregate to matter, to shift money where it could be consolidated. Called Marta first. Marta had been our bookkeeper since before I understood that a ledger was more than a word. She had the patient face of someone who had watched a lot of small disasters get quieted by practical action. When I asked her without drama whether the invoices for last 5 years looked consistent to her, she took her time, then sighed a long dry sound that was almost a laugh. That little tilt, I noticed it, she said. I thought I'd misread it. I'm old enough for mistakes, Ava. But when I looked again, it wasn't a mistake. We began to pull at that thread. Anyone can turn a suspicion into a conspiracy in the dark. I've seen that happen to people who want to be right more than they want to know the truth. So we made a plan based on record and not on rumor. We copied everything. Marta and I spent nights sorting receipts into stacks while the rain slammed the windows. I learned how a small consultancy can be used as a sluice gate. One person's line item could be another person's off-ramp. I learned the language of nominee directors and mailbox addresses, of payments just small enough to dodge the bank's automated attention but consistent enough to affect a siphon. Lucas was the kind of man people trusted because he knew how to perform trust. He smiled at customers, worked press at town events, had a way of convincing people that he owned more than he did. He had been the face of Mercer Marine for years, At festivals, at the mayor's ribbon cuttings, in photos with clients, a golden child for a community that loves a local hero. Inside, the company accounts were a different kind of story. When I confronted him, it was an accident. I'd gone into his office for a file and found a wall of boxes labeled with different LLC names. He walked in, saw me, and his face did something like a tightness in a rope. For a moment, he looked surprised the way a man looks when he has been caught folding the laundry of a lie. "Ava," he said like a blank check. "You're here early." I asked about the boxes. He said they were old client files and that I must have misread a label. He said it with the measured ease of someone who runs on practiced ease. I did not raise my voice. I do not think it helps. I laid down the ledger extracts on the desk and said, "Why does Atlantic Advisory have a phone number that forwards to a mailbox in a neighboring state?" His jaw tightened in a way that split his face into two versions, the generous brother and the man with something to hide. "Those are legacy partnerships," he said. "Dad liked to keep things complicated." Legacy partnerships are often a euphemism for the decisions someone makes to keep control without explaining. I left with a box of client contracts and a polite smile, and the sense of a thing tightening like a noose. That night, I did the thing most people who discover betrayals won't do first. I sat with the question of motive. People think motive is obvious. Greed, jealousy, spite. Those are part of it. But motive is often softer-edged. The desire to be praised, the hunger to be seen, the fear of being left out. Lucas, in moments alone and when he thought no one watched, had always liked applause. He had used it to slide into conversations and places. He had also, it turned out, used it to move money. The first public step we took was careful. Documentation, not drama. Marta and I compiled a binder of transactions, each page annotated with clear notes. Priya, my friend from college who had become a lawyer, read our notes and told me bluntly that we had something that could stand up under scrutiny if we strengthened it with corroboration. Priya suggested a timeline and a list of which accounts to query legally. She taught me the right words to use when requesting bank records so the bank would not freeze everything on a whim and put workers out of a job while the queries were pending. That was an important ethical line for me. I did not want to destroy people who earned wages at our shop. I wanted accountability, not collateral damage. If your revenge hurts innocence more than it corrects wrong, you have not avenged anything. You've simply redistributed harm. We opened a temporary payroll account funded from my modest savings and a loan from a friend who believed the old hands mattered more than family drama. We kept the lights on and promised Marta we would not stop the dinghy of our small town at the dock. It's not glamorous work, funding paychecks in the middle of a fight. It is the work of human decency in the face of families that fracture. As we moved, Lucas and his lawyers tried the familiar plays. He accused us of sensationalism. He claimed I wanted publicity. He suggested that my job at a small design firm had given me an inflated sense of my own importance. He used the rhetorical levers family members use. Hurt, confusion, a suggestion that truth-telling is uncharitable. There was one moment I almost broke. The local paper ran a careful piece, not accusing, just noting that there were questions about Mercer Marine's recent transfers. People who came into the shop looked at me differently that week. I felt the eyes of customers I'd known since I was a girl. Old Mr. Hargreaves, who ran the bait shop and had never once spoken to me unkindly, looked like someone who had been handed the shape of a problem and didn't know how to react. That is the trouble with exposing wrongs. The innocent often first feel the shock of the reveal. But there was also a small, fierce clarity that came with having evidence. When you put facts on a table, people have the choice to look or to look away. They are responsible for whichever option they take. That clarity steadied me like a keel. We filed a formal request for an audit. The county regulators, a crusty woman named Ramsey who smelled of lemon oil and was known for being blunt, agreed to review the records. She treated our binder like a map and read it in the way you read ship charts. Careful, with an eye for currents. This could be simple bookkeeping oddities, she warned, or it could be intentional reroute. You have to be specific in your request. We were specific, and that specificity was a tool. Then things got quieter and sharper. Lucas's response escalated from rhetoric to more active measures. He began to pull clients into private meetings where he painted me as an intruder. He used the town's affection for him as a shield, and it worked on some. He also, and here the cruelty sharpened into weapon, started to insinuate that Dad's last weeks had been confused, that decisions made were perhaps not fully his own. It was a tactical move. Seed doubt about the author of the will to undercut our case. People who loved my father did not like the idea that he had made decisions while not entirely himself. Even the suggestion of that can be effective, it muddies the narrative. I understood then the ugly calculus of power. If you can persuade people to doubt the source of a document, you can overturn the document's meaning. I had to defend not just the money trail but the intention behind the will. I needed to show that Dad had chosen with a steady hand, even if his handwriting sometimes trembled when he was tired. We asked for independent verification of the will's signing. We located witnesses who had been in Dad's presence, a banker who had been called for questions about estate paperwork, a nurse who had come in on an emergency, friends who had dined with Dad the month before his passing. We gathered dates, times, and small attestations that he had been lucid enough to make choices. It was the sort of tedious human work that makes courthouse dramas feel less glamorous than they look in movies. Meanwhile, there were quieter things that shook my stomach. Someone seized a photograph from the shop, an old picture of Dad with his arm around both of us by the harbor. It had been pinned near the register for years. One morning it was gone. Another photograph, Dad at a charity event, was slightly torn at the corner. These were the acts of people who believed the world could be coerced into silence by scare tactics. They were small, personal, and intended to unsettle. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address and careful handwriting. Inside were 3 words and a single smudged fingerprint. Stop. M. The note did not frighten me the way a blunt threat might. It was a strange kind of acknowledgement. Someone, likely close to the action, wanted the conflict to end and had decided to use fear to demand it. The initial surge of anger, the kind that wants to answer a slap with a shove, felt raw. But I kept the letter and showed it to Marta and Priya. They read it and told me what I already felt. Intimidation often precedes greater action. We filed it with our counsel and our regulator. I slept poorly that week and made sure the cameras at the shop were angled to record faces. There is a peculiar gravity to a life that's been made public in parts. You think the world will see you as you are. Mostly it sees the closest synopsis. I kept working the way Dad had taught me. Small improvements to hulls, karate kick grins when clients barged in with crises, the patience to wait for epoxy to cure. Work steadied me more than outrage. It was a discipline. The audit began. It was slower than I wished. Archives resist being forced open. Banks delay. Legal teams file motions. But each subpoena produced a paper trail. And each paper trail narrowed the story. We found more than we'd first suspected. Invoices for consultancy disguised as legitimate services. A nominee director who changed addresses frequently. Paid rents on warehouses that contained little more than moved inventory. It was organized enough to be intentional, clumsy enough to leave a mark a careful person could read. And then, one evening as I was closing the shop and counting the day's repairs, a ritual that made me feel anchored, a delivery man approached with a stack of envelopes. They were addressed to the board, copies of bank transfers made public in a way the bank would not allow but press would. Inside, the first envelope contained a photograph that made my hands go cold. It showed Lucas standing in a rented office across state lines with the logo of Atlantic Advisory on the wall behind him. He was speaking into a microphone to a room of people who believed they were listening to a man of business. The photograph had a timestamp and an address. It was proof in color and light. It was a piece of evidence that tied a smiling face to an office, to a direction of funds in a way that was hard to argue away. Someone had sent it anonymously, with the clear intent of forcing action by making things visible. I sat at the desk and felt exhaustion and a curious, cold satisfaction. The road ahead was not pretty. There would be lawsuits and town gossip and nights when I would fear the ripple effects on people who had nothing to do with all of it. But there was, finally, a thing of weight to place on the table. Documentation is a kind of truth because it insists on being answered. Dad used to say you could tell a good ship from the way it returned to harbor, Marta said quietly as she looked at the photograph. He'd say, a good ship comes home with all its seams stitched, even if the waves thought it might not. We were in the stitching phase. I thought of my childhood stitches and how they had taught me to be exact. I thought of how odd it was that the same lessons you learn on a boat, patience for curing epoxy, the need to measure twice and cut once, are the skills you need when people betray you. This was the practical education of a slow repair. Part 1 closes on a small, unsettled triumph. The regulators had begun their inquiry. The anonymous photograph had found its mark. The letter had been filed as intimidation. The payroll fund kept the crew paid. I had allies. Marta, Priya, Amira, and a small network of old clients who'd waited at the counter for decades. The town hummed with rumors, and Lucas gathered more people to his side by offering charm and comfort. He would not go quietly. I did not intend for him to. I also found a strange kinship forming beneath the stress, not with him, but with the town and the men and women who inhabited our shop. They were the ones who did not sign contracts to shift funds. They were the ones who had calloused hands and honest jokes. They did the work and deserved an honest company to depend on. That realization settled itself like ballast. The story properly is only just beginning. Revelations are slow things. Not fireworks but long latent swells. I had made the first moves and they had been measured and, I hoped, fair. The next steps would demand strategy, courage, and an unwillingness to let fear set the map. Lucas would retaliate. People would have to choose sides. There would be small cruelties and larger consequences. But if the sea teaches anything, it teaches the necessity of steady hands, of knots tied well and never flung in anger. I closed the ledger that night and, for a long moment, let the dark of the shop be honest. Outside, the harbor breathed. Inside, I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee that had gone cold and thought about the stitches I would have to make. To the company, to the town, perhaps even one day, to whatever remained of my family. I did not yet know how far I would go, only that I would go far enough to see that the work was done right. The next few weeks moved like a tide that wouldn't heed the shoreline's patience. Slow at first, then sudden in its force. News of the audit leaked in the way small towns leak everything. A neighborly whisper, a phone call that got passed on, a barista who mentioned it while making a latte. People leaned into doorways and asked questions they pretended not to ask. Some looked at me with curiosity. A handful looked with anger. Mostly, they looked with the neutral bewilderment that follows the discovery that the quiet life you assumed was steady may have been quietly tilted. Regulator Ramsey arrived at the shop with a clipboard and sensible shoes. She had a way of looking through people the way a beacon looks through fog, with blunt, necessary light. She took the ledger Marta had prepared and read it as if she were matching a tide chart to a storm. Her verdict, spoken without melodrama, worried me less than it should have. There's enough here to justify a deeper look. We'll need full access to corporate accounts and any nominee records. She didn't say guilty. She didn't say innocent. She said process. And process is what the law runs on until a judge gives it a name. Lucas didn't sit idle. He used other levers. First he leaned into charisma, the kind that has always served him as a political weapon. He hosted a breakfast at the yacht club and invited clients with fondness-tinged loyalty. He used the town's affection for his family to create a buffer. Then he deployed legal counsels who moved like sharks with clipboards. They sent letters to Priya, polite, threatening, litigious in tone, suggesting defamation suits and emotional stress. They asked for depositions. They tried to frame our actions as a vendetta rather than an audit. That framing was dangerous because the court of public opinion can be as merciless as any legal tribunal. But the difference between theatrics and something that lasts is evidence. We had evidence. We kept reminding ourselves to let the documents do the talking and not to let rhetoric drag us into a contest of who could shout loudest. There was a moment when my resolve almost wavered. I had been receiving thin, veiled threats. The stop M letter had not been isolated. My work van's tires were slashed one rainy morning. A smear of paint, a crude message daubed on the side of a dumpster near the shop. Traitor, left a sour animal burn in my chest. The small cruelties of people who assume power because they can make things hurt felt like an attempt to hollow me. I was not the kind of person who wanted confrontation for its own sake. I wanted to be precise. What steadied me were the practical acts everyone loves but no one praises. Marta's patient cross-checks, Priya's careful legal phrasing, Amira's contact at the local radio station who agreed to run a neutral piece about fair process and the importance of not cutting jobs while investigations proceed. The crew, the men and women who had been fixing boats since before I was born, kept showing up. They did the work. The odd jobs, the tough welds, the night shifts when a client's engine went down. And the sound of the shop was at once defiant and stubbornly ordinary. That sound stopped me from turning my anger into an unhelpful noise and reminded me that the true aim was steady work and legitimate accountability. The audit was a slow unfurling. Bank records came, thanks to Priya's deft legal letters. Email headers were examined. IP addresses matched the time-stamped invoices. We discovered patterns that sketched the contours of a siphon. Small, repeated transfers moved through Atlantic Advisory and other shell entities. Amounts that, in isolation, looked like normal consulting fees, but which, in pattern, suggested an engineered bleed. An address in a neighboring state that had no actual staff was listed as a nominee office. A series of warehouse leases showed payments without corresponding cargo manifests. It was, in short, enough to call for action. Action came quickly and with teeth. Subpoenas were issued and bank accounts were temporarily frozen. That freeze was the most morally complicated thing in the world. On paper it is a defense mechanism, but it also has teeth that bite into people who don't deserve to be punished. I had prioritized payroll precisely to avoid a domino of suffering, yet the freeze caused panicked calls anyway. We moved money into escrow, wrote to creditors, negotiated terms. I learned the particular rhythm of crisis management. Calm voice, precise action, empathy for people on the line. Lucas's reaction escalated in an ugly, personal way. He began to contact old allies of Dad's, men who had once been sworn in by our family's name and who still felt allegiance to a memory they preferred to believe in. Some of them were susceptible to the argument that an audit is a slur. Others were not. When he couldn't sway the regulators, he turned to intimidation. One night, a brick shattered the front window of the shop. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. The stakes had climbed. Ramsey called an emergency meeting at Town Hall. She insisted on public transparency about process. Not the gossip but the mechanics. She explained what an investigation could do and what it likely would not do immediately. She was tireless in saying that an audit is not a trial and that guilt is not a foregone conclusion. People listened with the earnest unease only a small town can generate, equal parts curiosity and solidarity. But the subtle, insidious move that cut deeper was the whisper campaign Lucas initiated about Dad's state of mind in his final months. He suggested, in the barroom politeness of those who know how to poison a subject without accusation, that Dad might not have been fully of sound mind when the will was signed. The implication was toxic because it offered plausible deniability, a medical excuse that, if believed, could erode the will's authority. I felt like someone trying to defend a book while people argued over whether the pages had been torn by age or by intent. I went to the nursing service and gathered witness statements. Old friends who had visited Dad, the man who had come to shovel the driveway, the hospice nurse who'd helped with nighttime care. I made sure the last weeks were documented not with sympathy but with the clinical clarity a legal process appreciates. That clarity steadied a corner of the storm. Dad had been lucid enough to sign. He had made choices. Those choices were the map. You cannot, I thought fiercely, have a map and then ask to unmake it for convenience. In the middle of the legal grind, there were human surprises that kept me afloat. A young mechanic, Tariq, who had started at the shop as an apprentice and whose mother cleaned houses in town, quietly handed me a battered envelope. Inside was a small note. "We trust you. Keep the lights on." It was not a declaration of allegiance to my family, but a plea to keep people employed. The plea was a quiet moral directive that I could not ignore. It shaped the way I moved forward, with precision and with a commitment to minimize collateral damage. The town's sympathy was divided. Some stood with Lucas, the charismatic heir apparent who promised continuity. They wanted their familiar face. Others, the ones who had worked alongside Dad for years, watched the facts with a wary wisdom. The difference between sympathy and allegiance is where people decide whether to side with an idea or with evidence. It is a slow shift, not an earthquake. Meanwhile, an investigative journalist named Elise, a woman with a sharp profile and an uncanny ability to hunt down paper trails, reached out after a local contact suggested she look into what had happened to Mercer Marine. She met me at a coffee shop with a notebook and an attention that felt like a net. "I don't want theater," she said, tapping her pen. "I want truth. If there's a pattern, we'll show it. If not, we'll say that too." Elise's involvement changed the dynamic in a small but crucial way. She asked hard questions and demanded corroboration. She wasn't interested in drama. She was interested in the public's right to know where their town's economy stood. That reframing, from family feud to public accountability, nudged some undecideds toward careful observation rather than reflexive support for whichever person wore the older family name. Legal hearings began to stack. Depositions pulled the faces of people I thought I knew into a stringent format where words had to be exact and memory had to be defensible. Lucas's lawyers attempted obfuscation, ambiguous invoices, poorly described line items, and a flurry of consultancy that sounded impressive until you followed the money. Priya was methodical. She taught me the art of answering only what was asked and keeping emotion out of the transcript. It's a dull and brave kind of discipline, strategic silence that starves drama. At home, my mother, still living in the house Dad had been allotted as a life interest, began to show cracks. The legal wrangling pulled at her nerves. She had always been practical in the ways that sustain a family. Casseroles for neighbors, a steady hand on our childhood stitches. But she had also known family secrets, the kind that ride under the smooth surface of decent lives. One afternoon she called me and, in a voice that had the frailness of someone who'd seen too much, confessed she had once noticed invoices being redirected but hadn't questioned them seriously. "I thought," she said, "I thought you were safer if I kept quiet." Those words landed like stones in my lap. It is one thing to prosecute a wrong. It is another to realize that mundane acts of omission can constitute the scaffolding of a greater betrayal. I did not fold into outrage. I asked calm questions and then asked for help. She volunteered at the shop, at first awkwardly, and slowly helped with small tasks that required no ledger but a steady hand. Folding tarps, making tea for the crew, cleaning the shop's small kitchenette. It was a humbling human work that made her apology less theatrical and more useful. On the legal front, a subpoena produced a surprising name. Harper & Neal Consulting, a firm with an address in the city that matched invoices but which, when inspected, had a nominee director whose signature matched one we had seen in Lucas's paperwork. We followed the lines and found a web of companies with interlocking ownership, the sort that, once traced, reveals intent in the way stitches reveal a seam's pattern. It required patience and methodical search, which Priya and Elise and Ramsey pursued like a shared and necessary duty. Lucas's pressure tactics became harsher. A smear piece suggested I was using Dad's death as a means to appropriating media attention. Someone vandalized a commemorative plaque at the harbor. I had nights where I'd sit at the edge of the dock and listen to the harbor breathe, because the sea's rhythm has a way of returning a person to scale. Rage distilled into strategy when I could make it do what needed doing. Bank requests, subpoenas, interviews. Fury, left to its own devices, burns. Fury harnessed is a machine that can correct wrongs. Midway through the season, a small victory arrived. A regional court granted a temporary injunction preventing certain transfers from being processed and placed a forensic accountant on the case at the county's request. It was not a full vindication, but it was a legal recognition that the evidence warranted a deeper probe. That recognition hit the town's grapevine like a bell. Something more formal had taken the question from village gossip and placed it under the law's patient light. The reaction was immediate. Some clients began to withdraw their contracts out of fear. Others stayed, waiting for resolution, grateful for the transparency we had insisted upon. I found myself in hundreds of small conversations, with suppliers who worried about being paid, with employees who feared layoff, with long-term clients who weighed loyalty to the family name against the evidence now unfolding. Those conversations were not the stuff of heroics. They were the steady, mundane duty of a person determined to protect livelihoods while letting truth be seen. Lucas became increasingly desperate. He made an offer, a private settlement, that was essentially a request to hand authority back to him in exchange for silence. The offer came with a kind of charm that had always been his strongest trait. Make my mistakes private, Ava. Keep the town out of it. We can make this right with a handshake. The price of that handshake, I realized, was not money alone but the currency of concealment. I declined quietly. There are times when silence is compassion. There are other times when silence is consent. The case built to a crescendo at a county hearing where both sides presented preliminary evidence, and the judge had to decide whether to proceed to a full trial. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse buzzed with people who wanted to see which way the scales would tip. Lucas sat like a man waiting for an intervention that would absolve him. My mother sat behind me and clutched my hand. In that grip there was apology and fear and a shared history that had been rent. The judge, when she spoke, was an older woman with a face like carved oak. She had a blunt way of parsing things. She read the documents, listened to Priya's calm voice, and heard Lucas's lawyers offer plausible deniability. Then she said something that felt like a compass setting. This court will not substitute rumor for evidence. We will proceed according to what records show and what witnesses can attest. She ordered a deeper forensic accounting and forbade any parties from disposing of assets pending the review. That order felt like a victory. It was not a triumphalist trumpet blast. It was a slow, bureaucratic thing that meant the law would move with the thoroughness it requires. In the days that followed, we found more records. Emails where Lucas's instructions were explicit, and a set of invoices that matched payments to companies with little or no receipts of service. Patterns congealed. The truth, messy, inconvenient, human, began to look less like opinion and more like a map. Amid the legal grinding, human moments remained small and crucial. I would walk the shop at dawn and stand by the benches where men had sanded for years, and they would nod in quiet approval. They were not people of elegant speeches. They were people who understood the meaning of steady hands and the virtue of showing up. Their quiet support mattered more than any headline. Then an unexpected voice amplified our case. Elise, the journalist, published a piece that paired the forensic account's emerging pattern with interviews of long-term suppliers who had noticed odd payments. Her piece was careful, citing records and quotes, and it did not gloat. It simply laid out the narrative as it stood. Questions that needed answers, workers who needed protection, a family whose public image no longer matched the ledgers. That article shifted the town's air. People who had been uncertain now asked direct questions. Some clients checked contracts and invoices. A few stepped forward with documents of their own. Invoices paid with no corresponding deliveries, work times that didn't match payments. Memory is a strange thing. A suggestion planted for years can bloom only when watered by a reason to recall. Once a few recollections spoke, others followed. As part 2 ends, the battle lines are clearer. The audit continues. Legal hearings will follow. Lucas's charm is less effective in the face of records and witness testimony. The town's sympathy is divided but leaning toward a demand for accountability. The shop hums with work and with the weary satisfaction of people who know they are doing the right thing. But the fight has cost me small things I had not predicted. Quiet nights robbed by anxiety, an erosion in relationships with people who had been my anchors, and a slow, private grief for a father who, whatever his faults, left me with skills and a moral compass that demanded I act. I am tired. I am precise. I am not vindictive for sport. I am avenging the truth that the people who keep our harbor safe deserve a company that honors their labor. The sea beyond the dock remains the same indifferent blue, waves against hulls, gulls wheeling. It does not care for our dramas. It teaches only that steady hands bring a vessel home. I intend to act like someone who knows how to stitch a torn hull, to take small, patient actions that, over time, make the whole seaworthy again. There will be more revelations. There will be greater tests, betrayals that cut deeper, alliances that disappoint, and the necessity of making a life that is not only about exposing wrongs but also about rebuilding what those wrongs have threatened. I brace myself for the hearings ahead, and I spend my nights learning how to be a different kind of leader, one who understands the cost of exposing a lie and who is willing to take responsibility for the rippling consequences. People keep asking me when the fear ends, when the bright, nervous edge that lives under your ribs finally dulls. There is no single moment. There are, instead, a sequence of small mercies and new responsibilities that together make the fear useful rather than paralyzing. Part 3 is the ledger of those small mercies and the larger tests that follow when the law starts to move like a slow, inevitable ocean. The forensic accounting team arrived with their own quiet gravity, a pair of men and a woman who smelled of paper and coffee and the kind of concentration that resembles patience. They set up at the shop like temporary fixtures, laptops, stacks of printouts, and an index of questions filed into manila envelopes. Their leader, a woman named Corinne, had a voice that was precise and kindly intimidating. "We will treat the records as if they were a crime scene," she said, and I liked her immediately because she spoke as if the documents themselves might have a say in how the truth was told. They started at the beginning. Bank statements were matched line for line against invoices. Dates were cross-referenced with shipment manifests and time cards. Phone records were analyzed with IP logs that showed where emails had originated. It was tedious and thorough work, the kind of work that takes pleasure in pattern recognition and that hates ambiguity. What emerged, slowly, was a deeper picture than any of us had guessed. Lucas had not acted alone. There were intermediary firms in the chain whose directors had the same initials as people who'd once been listed on our company's old client list. There were invoices that had been repeatedly reissued with different justifications, and then paid through accounts that belonged to shell companies with nominal addresses. A few payments had trickled through for years, amounts so small a single month's review might miss them, and then spiked in correlating months when a large contract was awarded or when certain vendors were delayed. That spike pattern is what law enforcement notices after a while. Not the singular theft but the rhythm that looks like someone learning how to siphon without being noticed. The forensic team annotated timelines that looked like topographic maps, and when I looked at one, I saw not just numbers but a story. Someone had slowly rerouted the river we thought ran constant. The more we found, the sharper Lucas's attempts to defend himself became. He hired a new legal team, the kind with flawless suits and a taste for obfuscation. They sent us motions, delay tactics, requests for clarification, and in the background, a public relations campaign that tried to pivot the story toward a family dispute-turned-legal narrative. That tweak is telling. It attempts to make your moral argument sound like personal preference rather than public accountability. It was slick and manipulative. We kept to our method. Priya taught me how to respond without blood in my voice. "You will be tempted to answer with the heat you feel," she told me at midnight while we went through the latest set of emails. "That is the moment you must remember you're building a court record. Heat is testimony in your head, but facts are testimony in the record." She was right. Court eats facts. It doesn't digest rage. Meanwhile, the community felt the ripples. Suppliers were nervous. A couple delayed contracts. One longtime client withdrew a maintenance contract because they feared being dragged into litigation. It hurt. Each loss a small referendum on whether our commitment to truth was worth reckoning. But other clients stood firm. A surprising number regarded the move toward transparency as a reason to deepen their loyalty. They wanted to be part of a future where contracts were simple, where invoices matched deliveries and where a handshake meant the same at the end of the day as it did at the start. Those who stayed became the backbone of the shop's interim resilience. There were nights I lay awake thinking about consequences, not as abstract notions but as the faces of people who depended on paychecks. Sometimes I'd drive to the harbor in the fog and watch the lights of the workboats as they slid by like slow fireflies. The harbor's rhythm always reminded me of the lesson my father taught me. A good harbor takes care of those who call it home. That lesson kept me from pursuing a petty victory that would have left livelihoods in ashes. The prosecuting attorney finally took formal interest when Curran's team presented their preliminary report to county investigators. It was a careful document. It didn't demand conviction as much as it demanded a full legal path. Subpoenas to offshore accounts, mutual legal assistance requests to other jurisdictions, and a recommendation to freeze certain assets pending the outcome. The county prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with a calm voice named Danvers, said she would move if the evidence supported prosecution. "We don't indict on rumor," she told me. "We indict on proof." I like that too. Proof is an ungiving, sometimes cruel thing, but it is also the only thing that prevents arbitrariness. Lucas's first real mistake came not in the courtroom but in his own circle. Confidence begets slippage, and slippage reveals character. At a private dinner in the home of a client he'd hoped to retain, he made a boast. Not a careful phrasing but a careless, heated confession about how old money finds ways to keep the ship afloat. Someone recorded him. The audio clip landed in Elise's inbox like a small, dark comet. She asked for corroboration and we provided context. The clip matched names and dates in the ledgers that Curran's team had flagged. The public nature of that recording made it harder for Lucas's lawyers to argue that everything had been aboveboard. The media crescendoed into a frenzy the day the clip aired. The harbor that had been a routine place for men to meet and talk and joke became an arena of voices. People lined the shop's windows, some with folded arms, others with tears. A few came to offer coffee and kind words. A few came to spit accusations. The town felt raw and exposed in a way that made everyone uncomfortable because the wound was not only monetary, it was the bruise of trust broken. Lucas's reaction grew more desperate. He attempted to buy loyalty by meeting with key clients privately, an old tactic that works when people can be persuaded your scandal is temporary if their contracts remain safe. But the clip had shifted the dynamic. Conversations that had previously been private and supportive turned cautious. Investors began to ask for audits. Banks, politely but firmly, flagged accounts for review. It is astonishing how a single recorded moment can recalibrate many small hands. The court date loomed. The county announced an initial grand jury review, a step toward indictment if the jury found probable cause. The courthouse steps filled not just with the town's usual faces, but with reporters and a smattering of folks from neighboring towns who had found the story compelling. I remember the day as a weathered thing. The sky was the pale blue of late fall and the courthouse flags moved slowly like the breathing of something that does not fret. People were there to watch a process that would determine not only a man's fate but the tenor of our town for years. The grand jury process is a strange one, secretive and procedural. You present evidence, and the jurors decide if charges should be brought. It's not a trial. It's closer to a referee deciding if the match can proceed. Priya prepped me for my testimony. How to answer directly, how to keep the story crisp, and how to let the documents do their work. "They want clarity," she said. "They don't want your performance." I testified with documents in hand, and the weight of those pages was literal. Paper is stubborn and heavy in a way that human anger is not. I spoke about patterns and transfers. I let Corinne explain the forensics. I did not perform. I describe. The grand jurors listened, asked practical questions, and then retreated to deliberate. In my head I rehearsed both outcomes, the charge and the no charge. Both were possible, both would matter. When the grand jury returned with a decision to indict, the news hit the town like a bell. Lucas was charged with counts of fraud, misappropriation, and a handful of financial offenses that might look small alone but that, together, described a sustained course of siphoning. He surrendered and was released on bail with strict conditions. The bail conditions included restrictions on his access to certain company documents and barred him from contacting key witnesses. There was no immediate jail time. Indictment is not conviction, but the formal legal step signaled that the state believed the evidence warranted a full trial. People reacted in ways that reflect how the heart processes law. Some rejoiced like a long-awaited catharsis. Others worried about the town's reputation. Some friends called to say they had feared Lucas's management style for years. Some relatives wept because the family name now carried legal stains. My mother, for her part, began to take longer walks in the mornings and to volunteer at a small downtown shelter. Her presence then, practical, doing the work of making meals, felt like reparation of an unornamented kind. The courthouse became a stage for small dramas. Lucas posted a public statement, composed in legal smooth phrases, claiming his innocence and blaming the whole affair on miscommunications and incomplete transitions in the company's growth phase. It was the language of obfuscation, designed to make omission sound like accident. He hired PR experts who managed interviews and attempted to paint a picture of a family wronged by internal politics. Meanwhile, the company required immediate management attention. The board had temporarily appointed an oversight committee with independent members, 3 local business owners, a retired accountant, and 2 long-time employees. The committee's first act was to lock down procurement processes and to require dual signatures for any major transfer. My role shifted again, from accuser to steward. People asked if I would step up to run an interim operations team. It was not a role I expected, but standing on the harbor steps watching men unload a boat does not give you the option of waiting for other people to save things that matter. I accepted the interim role with conditions. I would do emergency management for a fixed term and under an explicit governance structure that prioritized worker pay. I set up a transparent online ledger that staff and clients could access, a radical act in a town where accounting had always been private. I insisted on weekly briefings. People grumbled, some thought I wanted control, but most stayed. Many breathed easier knowing payroll had someone watching it who understood both the industry and the community. There were personal costs. Old friends who had been part of my life since before the shop began pulled away. Discomfort, fear, and the human penchant for choosing sides are powerful motives. I lost one steady client because they didn't want the hassle. I gained others who admired the transparency. The mercies were uneven. Lucas did not relent. He launched an aggressive attempt to discredit our evidence. He found a former employee who had been fired years ago and presented her as a whistleblowing source, claiming the ledger had been manipulated by me to bring him down. It was a grotesque inversion, the alleged victim trying to appear as the wounded party. Priya moved swiftly, securing emails and timestamps that contradicted her account. The court, which loves paper, noticed the inconsistencies. The attempt to smear was not successful, but it drained time and energy. Then came a betrayal that cut closer than any brick through glass. Marta resigned. She wrote a short letter explaining that the pressure had become too much and that her health required she step away. She said she loved the shop but could not endure the stress. Her resignation felt like a small death. Marta had been the slow heart that kept the books honest in warm times and in quiet ones. Her leaving meant we had to hire and train someone new, and it added to the weary months. I called Marta the night before her last day. She came to the shop with a small tin of cookies and a gaze that had less armor than before. "You did the right thing," she said simply. "Sometimes doing the right thing is lonely. It doesn't mean it wasn't right." I held her hands and asked her to consider consulting part-time. She agreed to return in a temporary role until we found and trained a replacement. Her agreement was a quiet mercy. Her brief farewell was a reminder of the cost accountability extracts. The trial preparations were long and layered. Witness lists grew. Depositions took hours. There were nights when I dreamt of the ledger pages turning into waves that would swallow the shop. I kept reminding myself that the law, slow and clumsy at times, is the mechanism we use to translate private pain into public remedy. I ran the shop during the days and slept in snatches as if the very act of remaining steady would make the truth feel less lonely. Then, in the small hour before dawn, something happened that neither law nor ledger could predict. My mother fell ill, a sudden collapse that landed her in the hospital with an arrhythmia. Hospitals have a way of shifting perspective. They reduce your returns calculus into simple human needs. Someone to hold a hand, someone to authorize care. I sat by her bed and watched the lines on the monitor like a song I no longer knew. In that hush, the legal battle seemed far away and petty. I felt the soft ache of regret for the things left unsaid with her. She recovered slowly. The recovery was not a cinematic moment of forgiveness, but a series of small, awkward steps. A note left on my desk, a short visit to the shop, her hands learning again how to fold a tarp without quivering. She began to volunteer at the pantry again. Her presence at the shop, when she could manage it, felt like an admission and a small ceremonial return to the ordinary labor of people who mean to be useful. As summer warmed into a late, forgiving season, the trial date was set. The town felt like a held breath. I remember walking the docks one evening with Priya and Elise. We watched the gulls wheel. Elise had her notebook but less of the appetite for drama she'd had at first. "I came for a story," she said quietly. "But I stay for the people who actually care what truth does afterward." That line lodged in my chest because it reminded me why I had leaned into the work. Not for headlines, but because a harbor deserves honest stewards. Lucas's trial would be messy. It would be public, and it would reveal things that would pain people who had nothing to do with the theft. But it was necessary. That is the hard lesson the law keeps teaching. Justice is not only about punishing the guilty, it is also about creating structures that prevent the next theft. I had wanted the shop to survive. In the work of survival, I had also learned how to protect more than a balance sheet. I had learned how to protect a town from becoming a place where silence covers harm. As Part 3 closes, the trial is days away and the harbor hums with people who are both weary and resolute. The shop continues to send out vessels into the night. Employees clock in. Suppliers call. The work, the ordinary stubborn thing that feeds a community, presses on. I am still afraid on some nights. I admit that. But fear at this point is a tool that reminds me what matters. Fidelity to the people who cannot bear the cost of quiet theft. There will be more tests. There will be appeals and small humiliations. People will write articles that twist truth for clicks. But there will also be small human moments. Marta's return to oversee the handoff, a supplier who tells me he'll extend our line for another month, a young apprentice who says he joined because he wanted to work for people who keep their word. Those moments stitch the long days into something that looks less like a vendetta and more like careful repair. If the law does its work, Lucas will face consequence, and the company will be reorganized with a governance that includes worker representation and independent oversight. If the law stumbles, the work of repair will still be necessary. A different set of steps with fewer legal tools but still the same moral imperative. Protect the vulnerable, make truth visible, and prevent repetition. I walk the shop in the long of morning and listen to the sound of saws. The sound is a promise that even when people break trust, the small acts of honest work can keep a place alive. Part 3 is not the triumph nor the end. It is the hard middle, the part where you learn not only how to expose a wrong but how to hold accountable the fragile lives caught in its wake. The story moves toward the trial and toward whatever comes after. I will be there, ledger in hand, ready to let the facts speak and to do whatever is required to keep the harbor safe. The trial ended not with a single trumpet but with a long, careful accounting. Truth rarely arrives as the cinematic clap of lightning people expect. It comes as papers shuffled, as witness boxes filled, as jurors read and reread the same facts until stories snap into neat, boring evidence. The judge called the case with the measured patience of someone used to holding other people's moral emergencies in her hands. I sat in the courtroom every day the trial ran. I listened to numbers read into the record and to explanations that turned motive into sequence. Lucas's lawyers tried to humanize him. They described hubris as ambition and financial misstep as honest mistake. Our side, the prosecution and the forensic team, presented patterns and timestamps. Corinne walked jurors through spreadsheets like a surgeon pointing out the exact cut. Priya sat next to me and kept her voice low and practical in the pauses between testimony. Marta came frequently, sometimes sitting in the second row, sometimes bringing me a coffee with both hands as if to say, without words, "Keep going." The prosecution's strategy was simple and effective. Show a pattern of redirection, then show who benefited. It was not about theatrics. It was about showing that over time a person can create a system of quiet theft that looks, in any single month, like a clerical oddity. Put enough months together and it is a crime. The jury, ordinary people called from ordinary lives, responded to the accumulation. They saw the river diverted drop by drop. Lucas's defense tried two things that every good defense tries: dilution and doubt. They introduced alternative explanations and questioned motives. They found a few small clerical errors that were legitimately confusing. They called expert witnesses who disputed a forensic method here or there. It was tedious and lean. In the end, though, the weight of repeated anomalies and corroborating testimony, suppliers who testified about missing deliveries, clients who spoke of unexplained invoices, a contractor who produced a cancelled check for work that had never been done, tipped the scales. When the jury returned a verdict of guilty on several counts, the sound in the courtroom seemed to expand, like a held breath finally released. There was no jubilation in me. I had not expected rejoicing. The verdict was a practical thing, a legal accounting, and it made possible the restitution mechanisms that would follow. Lucas sat with his head down. I caught a brief, instant look at him, a man who had been both kin and conundrum, and I felt the complicated knot of pity and justice tighten and then loosen. Sentencing was measured. The judge balanced restitution with the realities that incarceration alone does not fix wrongs committed in business. You need recovery plans, transparency, a restructuring that prevents repetition. Lucas received a sentence that included community service, a restitution schedule, and supervised restrictions on his financial activities. He was ordered to assist in identifying assets traceable to the misappropriated funds. It was not a theatrical punishment, but it was consequential. The judge's final words in court, about accountability and the duty of stewards, felt like a legal benediction. After the verdict and sentencing, the long business of repair began in earnest. We had established an oversight fund early in the process, a repository for restitution that the court would monitor. The oversight committee expanded to include outside trustees, a retired judge, a representative from a local charity, and 2 community-elected members. We used those funds to make direct payments to the suppliers who had been hurt, to rehire some displaced employees, and to establish a small grants program for family-run vendors who had been left too vulnerable by the gaps. Running the shop in the months following the trial tested my endurance in new ways. There were nights when lawsuits continued to nest in the periphery, vendors making claims, contractors anxious about timelines. There were also mornings when someone would bring in a return customer and say, quietly, "We stuck with you because you didn't run." Those small testimonies stitched slow seams. They were not applause, but they were steadier. My role shifted from interim manager to steward of the reformation. I worked with accountants to implement new checks, dual signatures for significant transfers, quarterly independent audits, mandatory disclosure of related party transactions, and a whistleblower hotline that reported directly to the oversight trustees. We rewrote the governance charter. We built a small staff training program on ethics and transparency. People asked why I had not taken the easier route of selling the business to someone with a cleaner balance sheet. The answer was a practical kind of love. The shop was less a commodity than a community anchor, and anchors are worth fighting to keep grounded. The social consequences were slower and more delicate. Friends returned in various ways. Some needed distance, some needed time. My mother, who had come to sit in the back of the courtroom and watch legal consequence unfold like something she had feared and now had to accept, started to attend the club night I had organized for local small business owners. She brought a dish once in a blue moon and then gradually more often. We did not have a dramatic reconciliation where everything was made new. Instead, we had a string of small conversations over coffee, a few shared errands, and a moment at the end of the second year where she slipped a note into my hand that read, simply, "I am learning." Those 2 words were not absolution, but they were a beginning. Lucas's path was not a private vanishing. He did what the court required. He worked during community service, helped with identifying assets, and attended weekly financial ethics classes. He tried, clumsily, to speak at a community meeting once, and the audience response was a mosaic. Some people offered questions that invited learning, others remained distant. Repentance, we reminded ourselves, is private labor that may not be accepted publicly. It is not a currency you can spend to buy back reputation wholesale. At work, I started a modest apprenticeship program aimed at young people who had not had access to vocational paths. The idea was straightforward: turn the story of our rupture into an opportunity to prevent similar harm elsewhere. We trained apprentices in honest accounting, in contract management, in ethics, skills that could make a structural difference in small businesses across the county. The program attracted a surprising number of applicants who had previously thought a small shop was an unlikely place to launch a career. Those apprentices brought a new energy to the floor, youthful precision and a steady willingness to learn. Months became a year, and the oversight structure began to bear fruit. The shop's profits stabilized. Suppliers who had once been wary grew comfortable again. The grants program helped a dozen family vendors stay solvent. We published quarterly transparency reports that the trustees reviewed and the public could access. Transparency, it turned out, has its own gravitational pull. Once you commit to it, people hold you to a higher standard. I found that comforting rather than burdensome. There were other small, surprising satisfactions. We restored a small portion of the backroom to a community corner where people could gather and access bookkeeping help. The local college invited me to give a guest lecture in their business ethics course. I spoke about pattern recognition, how theft often hides in habits, in deliberate smallness rather than in dramatic theft. I taught students how to ask tough questions about related party transactions and how to enforce checks and balances without alienating long-time partners. It felt good to turn hard experience into practical education. Outside work, my life took on a slower rhythm. I dated, tentatively, years after the trial. I learned to trust small courtesies again. A friend who showed up with soup on a hard day. A neighbor who watered my plants when I traveled. Trust, once broken, doesn't return as it was. It returns as something rebuilt. Cautious, grateful, and at times more beautiful for the deliberate care it requires. One afternoon, 2 years after the verdict, the town held a modest public ceremony to mark the shop's centennial. A strange and tender coincidence. We had cleaned the windows, polished the counters, and set up a table with bread and preserves made by local vendors. My mother came and stood quietly off to the side. Her hands folded in that way long-practiced women fold their hands when they want to be useful but invisible. Lucas, not a man of ceremony anymore, sent a handwritten note that read, "I am part of the mess I made. I am doing the small work I can. I will not ask for your forgiveness. I offer instead the truth of what I will do." He did not attend in person. The note was enough. At the ceremony, a woman I had never met before walked up to me. She had a small child perched on her hip who clutched a handmade wooden toy. "Your apprenticeship program took my son," she said. "He learned how to file and how not to be cheated. He's a steady worker now. He sleeps better." The woman's gratitude landed like an offered hand. "You kept this place for us," she said simply. That statement, blunt and practical, felt like the heart of everything I had done and everything I had lost to get there. The years after the trial taught me that revenge without repair is an echo chamber. I had said this before, but living it is different than saying it. The work of repair requires you to be present in the boring middle months when few cameras roll, and when the only reward is that someone gets a check on time or a child has a field to play on. The legal result was necessary. It was not the end. The end was the slow work of building practices that make theft harder and honesty easier. There were private reckonings that never fully resolved. My father's health declined and he died 2 years later. In the quiet of his small funeral, I felt a weight that was neither simple relief nor triumphant joy. People I had thought would never speak to me came by with small notes. My mother read a letter at the graveside that she had written, trembling about wanting to be better. I forgave in small, practical ways after that, by agreeing to help with legal forms she could not read, by sitting with her while she sorted old recipes. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant choosing to use my energy for repair rather than for blame. I have carried 2 lessons forward in the work I do and the way I live. The first is procedural. Build systems that make accountability ordinary. Contracts with dual oversight, independent audits, and community input clauses are not glamorous, but they matter. The second is moral. People erode trust in ways both dramatic and small. They lie, they hide, they rationalize. Justice requires both the blunt instrument of law and the meticulous instrument of daily care. Sometimes, late at night when the shop is silent and the lights of the harbor are steady, I walk the floor and run my hand along the grain of a table my father once sanded. I think of the ledger of unsent letters he left behind, the faint human attempts to explain himself, and I think about how imperfect we all are. I think about Lucas and the choices he made, and about how his arrogance became a lesson for a town. I think about the apprentices who came in with clean curiosity and left with skills that would protect them and others. There are scars. There are family relationships that will always carry the imprint of what happened. Some friendships remain broken. Some trust can never fully return. But the shop stands. The apprentices teach a new generation. The oversight fund supports suppliers in need. The town, stubbornly and beautifully, goes on. If you ask me whether I regret the long fight, I think of the rows of people who were able to keep roofs over their heads because payroll continued. I think of a child learning to measure in centimeters, not to steal trust but to build a frame. I think of quiet mornings when the shop bell rings and someone new walks in and says, "I heard you do the work right here." That answer, that small, ordinary testimony, is the closest thing I have to a verdict that matters. We could have burned everything down and watched the flames. Instead, we chose to clear the damage, to rebuild the beams stronger than before, and to teach people to read the map so they would not be misled again. The work is not glamorous. It is, at times, brutal. It is also, by its nature, hopeful. This is the final chapter of what we lived through. Not an end of consequences but a beginning of the honest work that follows. I do not claim heroism. I claim responsibility. I claim a life reconstructed by patient people who did not want vengeance as spectacle but repair as practice. The harbor still breathes. The shop bell still rings. People still come in and out, and I, still learning how to be both hard and tender, keep the ledger open and the lights on.